In July of 2019, every nation leaders from more than 80 nations gathered in Orlando, Florida, in the United States for the Every Nation Go conference. Ever since that conference, I've been hearing encouraging feedback from our pastors and missionaries around the world about our communion service. Planning a communion service for over 5,000 people in an unfamiliar setting proved to be a great challenge. Our team planned, prepared, and prayed for many months for that particular moment. And we're so thankful that people encountered God in a unique way. I've heard many pastors say that as a result of their experience, they're going to totally rethink how they do communion in their local churches. Rethinking communion and renewing our worship service practices can be a good thing. But if we do rethink it, there are 3 things we have to keep in mind. First, we must consider the theological significance of the particular worship practice and which specific theological points we want to emphasize. Second, we must consider our liturgical context. And finally, we must consider logistics and execution. People often want to start their planning sessions with questions about context and logistics, but it's important that we begin with theological reflection. When we began our planning for the Go Conference, our team repeatedly asked the question, what is the theological significance of communion? And what is the biblical foundation, or what did Paul and Jesus say about it? And how has the church unpacked the rich meaning of this sacrament for the last 2,000 years? These basic but profound biblical and theological questions are important starting points, but the next step is key. After our team spent some time reviewing the theological significance of communion, we had to decide which theological points we wanted to emphasize in that service. Whether we're talking about communion or baptism or marriage, Christian sacraments are full of biblical symbols and theological meaning. It's impossible to cover every meaning in a given service, so we have to choose. What are we going to emphasize today in this communion service? Well, there are many things we could have emphasized: forgiveness, the cross, God's love, the second coming. Our team decided to emphasize 2 truths: our oneness with Christ and our oneness with one another. This is how I explained it that night during the Go Conference communion moment. The sacrament of communion is a means of grace in which we celebrate the oneness we have with Christ and His body, the church. We do not participate in communion as mere individuals, but as members of the community of faith. Therefore, we believe that Jesus is truly present with us in the celebration of communion. Once we have figured out the specific points of theological emphasis, next we must consider our liturgical context. This one's really important. There are 2 realities about the context that we considered as we planned for the World Conference. First, we knew that communion was coming at the end of the last session, after my sermon. As a result, we worked hard to make sure that my sermon ended in a way that set us up well for communion. And we worked hard to make sure that the worship songs selected reiterated our intended theological significance. Second, we considered the audience. Unlike a regular Sunday service, which often has a mixture of committed church members, occasional attenders, and unsaved visitors, the Every Nation Go Conference audience was primarily pastors, missionaries, church staff, small group leaders from Every Nation churches all over the world. This context gave us the freedom to try something that normally would not work in a regular church service. We decided that in order to emphasize the communal nature of communion, we would have each person serve the elements to the person next to them. Emphasizing the global community of faith and the priesthood of believers created a really powerful moment. But it only worked because our specific context. We were a large gathering of believers with no unsaved visitors. Though this might work in some church contexts, like an underground house church in a restricted nation where everyone gathered as a part of the church community, it probably wouldn't work in a typical church setting where there are new visitors and unbelievers present. After we've decided on a theological emphasis and applied it to our specific liturgical context, then it's time to think about logistics and execution. Though this may seem like the least spiritually significant aspect of planning a communion service, it's crucial and should not be an afterthought. When we were planning for the GO conference, our biggest logistical concern was making sure that we could serve over 5,000 people in a reasonable amount of time. Some of our original ideas involved making people get out of their seats to receive the communion elements either at the front or at different places around the auditorium. Initially, this idea seemed like the best way to emphasize the importance of our global community. However, as we began to work out the logistics of moving thousands of people out of their seats to about 60 stations around the auditorium, we realized that though it was doable, it would take us way too long to serve everyone. It took us months of planning and tweaking and practicing and timing to figure out the best way to accomplish our goals. We ended up settling on people staying in their seats but serving communion to one another, passing the bread and juice down the row. Doing this required a lot of logistical coordination and planning, but the moment was successful because we gave our ushering team a lot of advance notice and listened to their concerns about some of our initial ideas. The result of these many months of planning and preparation was a powerful worship service where people from all over the world experienced communion with Christ and with one another. If you're a pastor or a worship service leader who is responsible for planning worship services, there are two ditches to avoid. The first ditch is holding uncritically to tradition for the sake of tradition. The second ditch is chasing fads and new practices without thinking about why we're doing them. When planning for the GO conference, we wanted to do something different that would take our conference participants out of their normal routine and help them experience this means of grace in a fresh way. We hope that this would prompt pastors and leaders to reevaluate the way they celebrate communion in their local churches. But we also knew that pastors should not copy and paste what they experienced at the conference because we had specific points of emphasis and we had a unique context. My prayer is that pastors all over the Every Nation world will do the hard work of theological reflection, contextualization, and logistical planning so that in every worship service, people will encounter Jesus and experience church community in a meaningful way.